During the Middle Ages, the present dark period of human history, science, philosophy, and even elementary hygiene, which were accepted in ancient Greece and Rome, disappeared under the pressure of militant feudalism and monarchy. These power systems blossomed like mushrooms after the rain, and after them came the mechanisms of control over people. The kings of France, Spain, and Rome replaced each other and redrew the borders of their states instantly, as if by a magical gesture. But at the same time, only one unshakable force, constantly increasing its power, remained the Catholic religion. In fact, Catholicism stood at the head of everything, and Roman popes for centuries instilled in every citizen a simple thought: power belongs to the emperor. Nevertheless, the Church was always close to this idea, and therefore, at the call of the Pope, people from all over Europe gathered for crusades, regardless of belonging to the state. In fact, the Church has become a parallel governing body, regardless of national borders. Every country had its faithful servants of Catholicism, but in fact they always obeyed Rome. To maintain order in each country, special services were created, and for the Catholic Church, such a service was the Inquisition, also known as the Holy Department investigating heretical sin. And here came the era of the disco, not in clubs with bright lights and loud music, but in the 4th century of our era. The Roman Emperor Constantine was excited by the idea of moving the capital closer to the borders. This is how New Rome was born, which became known in history as Byzantium, as well as Constantinople and, subsequently, Istanbul. Unlike previous pagan emperors, Constantine admired Christianity and soon after made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, becoming a Christian himself. He is also credited with the writing of the document, which talks about the transfer of power over the western part of the state to Pope Sylvester. Catholics used this document to assert their power and spread papal dominance throughout Europe. In 1517, it was officially confirmed. However, over time it became clear that such a document never existed, and many consider it an invention of the Church intended to strengthen its power. But by that time it was already too late. The Church as a whole, and the Pope in particular, firmly held control over the continent. The Holy Inquisition appeared under the influence of another important person, Frederick I Barbarossa. In 1184, he asked Pope Lucius III to introduce a system of search and punishment for religious crimes. Barbarossa's motivation was to expel and persecute representatives of other religions from the continent. In 1200, the next Pope, Innocent, officially established a new body, the Inquisition. Now it's time to introduce you to our guest, David Jimenez Silva, the Spanish Inquisitor. It was the Spanish division of the Inquisition that deserved the greatest fame in history, so we invited Mrs. Silva. The action takes place in 1485, and our David, dressed in church clothes, stands in the middle of the small town of Tamaris, not far from the Spanish Seville. He is surrounded by a dozen other church figures, and there is tension in the air. The smell of bonfires wafts through the air. The mechanism of work of the Inquisitor group under the leadership of David is quite typical for Europe at that time. He comes to the village, recruits local residents who reveal to him the heresy and sins of the population, after which a church tribunal is held. For this purpose, there was a standard questionnaire, which was filled out by residents of a city suspected of a high level of heresy. However, David's case had its own specifics. He was interested in people secretly practicing Judaism, in other words, Jews. The Spanish division of the Inquisition became especially famous because from the 8th to the 15th century, most of the Spanish peninsula was under the rule of Muslims, and Jews lived with them. Together with Christians, they made up 3 religious denominations. However, with the development of Christianity and the shift of power in the direction of Christians, the situation began to change. The Christians displaced the Arabs and began to pay attention to the Jews. As a result, many felt discontent that the Jews were in a privileged position. Disputes and conflicts became inevitable. Events unfolded at the end of the 14th century, when a rumor spread that Jews and Moors had conspired and intended to poison the wells, infecting people with the plague. Ultimately, it all came down to the fact that the less numerous and active Catholics put pressure on the Jews, forcing them to convert to Christianity. However, even after this, the Catholics did not stop, and the so-called conversos, forcibly converted Jews, continued to pour into society and even the government, which caused additional tensions. In 1478, Ferdinand II and Isabel officially created the Tribunal of the Holy Inquisition, and this was the beginning of the present Spanish Inquisition. Contrary to popular opinion, the main goal of the Spanish Inquisition was not the persecution of outwardly obvious heretics. Most of the work of the Inquisition in Spain was spent visiting towns and villages to identify new converts, former Muslims, and Jews who secretly continued to profess their former religion. By the way, by the time the Inquisition began to be directly managed from Rome, the Spaniards made their move and even stood up to the Pope, forcing him to officially approve their own inquisitorial institution. Let's return to Tamaris and consider the first myth. Our David Silva, like any Spanish inquisitor, is not at all a cruel beast, as history describes it. Arriving at the place, David proclaimed the traditional time of mercy, known as Edict. It was a 30-day period during which anyone could repent of their sins. The main addressees of this practice were, as a rule, Jews who sought to preserve their lives. However, the myth is that none of these sinners were punished. In fact, in most cases the offenders paid the fine. In this sense, the Spanish Inquisition worked quite advanced, resembling a control body, since, for example, if it was known that someone had hidden his Jewish beliefs for 6 months and during that time acquired 3 horses, David simply confiscated these horses from him as property, acquired in sin. The Inquisition also operated clearly with questions of dates, terms, and severe punishments, especially the Spanish one. However, the punishment often consisted in wearing a special penitent garment known as San Benito. People wearing these clothes felt disliked by others and avoided talking to them. Burning was a rare case and most often justified by very serious circumstances. For example, it could be a case of relapse or repeated violation. If David found a person in San Benito, who again committed actions indicating the Jewish faith, he had no choice but to sentence him to the treasury. Also, a Jew or a Muslim who held a high social status and maintained active ties with similar groups could be sent to the stake. Now it becomes clear that the Inquisition, at least in the early periods of Spanish history, served not only to search for heretics. This was a complex mechanism for identifying hidden infidels and ensuring the stability of society. However, to extract information about secret societies, David and other inquisitors resorted to torture. In the Middle Ages, torture was widespread and was even used to reveal information from common bread thieves in order to find out who their accomplices were. When our David completes the examination of all cases and makes final decisions, he will organize an auto da fe. This is a general term for Inquisition events at which sentences were announced. Most often, auto da fe resembled a theatrical production and attracted the inhabitants of the entire village. At this moment, our Silva solemnly announced the sentence, often accompanied by fines and confiscation of property. Villagers faced punishment for their faith or various violations, and such actions created fear and anxiety in people. During auto da fe, there was also a performance of those who managed to repent during the 30-day period. The Pope publicly apologized, showing remorse, and received special clothing. Those who broke the laws and faith immediately after auto da fe dressed in this symbolic clothing. Bonfires were lit during the event, and there were also places for those who were guilty, sometimes, of course, by mistake. Forced by mistakes and inaccuracies, extortions often occurred because of belief in secret societies. Regarding the horrors and insanity of the Inquisition, it should be remembered that the widespread statement about millions of burned people is far from the truth. During the reign of General Inquisitor Torquemada, 2,200 people were burned during 15 years. A significant part of them, in fact, were only dummies, since the real culprit was hiding. Most of the executions fell on those who called themselves converts, recently converted Jews who did not renounce their former faith. Torquemada went down in history as a synonym for the cruelty of the Church, but this is far from the complete picture. In total, during the period of his leadership of the Inquisition, civil courts not connected with the church burned 8,800 people, which testifies to the difficult circumstances of that time. Returning to David, it is worth noting that his power as an inquisitor incomparably exceeded the powers of an ordinary policeman. At that time, if the church came to the city with an inspection, no one, not even the king, had the right to oppose it. For example, King Robert II of France divorced his wife in 998 against the will of Pope Gregory V. Excommunicated from the church, he fulfilled his royal duties, but practically stopped interacting with the church. However, inquisitors were free from restrictions and could freely interfere in the affairs of even kings, and all things that Robert touched were subsequently destroyed. In addition, the only permissible ritual of becoming a king was baptism. The Spanish Inquisition had a significant influence, but it was only a distant echo of the perverted morals of the Middle Ages. It cannot be denied that at that time it was only part of the usual routine and was present in most areas of life. It is important to remember that torture and capital punishment were typical in medieval Europe, and the Inquisition, although it is considered a symbol of the cruelty of the church, did not go beyond the general practice of that time. Indeed, there is nothing purely positive in history, and every epoch is reduced to a complex interaction of the strong and the weak, and the latter suffer. In this regard, the Inquisition is no exception, and it left its mark on the path of progress. It is worth noting that the Inquisition did not lease its existence. Nowadays, it exists in the form of a congregation of the doctrine of faith and officially operates, although without the use of torture and capital punishment. Its functions are now focused on maintaining the doctrine of faith and controlling the correctness of teachings within the church. Means of influence, such as torture and punishment, have long gone into the past, and the modern Inquisition concentrates its activities on ensuring dogmatic purity. Closing the window into history, we see that the Inquisition was only a reflection of its time and circumstances. Her methods and actions may cause shock and horror, but they carefully fit into the context of medieval Europe. Moreover, the influence of the Inquisition on the cultural and political development of Spain is difficult to assess ambiguously, since it accompanied other processes in the country. The Inquisition may have had some influence on the strengthening of religious unity and stability in Spanish society, but it was also accompanied by oppression and persecution of those who deviated from the correct faith.